Time to let you peek behind the curtain, to look inside the window of the Cover Killer Nation studios, and see what really goes on whenever I'm listening to a bad album. Or what makes a bad album? What really does make a bad album? The reason why I'm focusing primarily on the bad, and 2013 was a great example, there were a lot of bands, a lot of albums that the public, and you guys in the nation, were pretty divided on, that got 7 or 8s as far as the rating was concerned. Now, whenever you think about it, a 7 or 8 is essentially a 70 or 80%, which in most school systems is a D to a C, or a C+. It's 3.5 out of 4 stars. It's really something that just bows it as average, or slightly above average. So it's not necessarily something that is bearing compliment. However, I guess whenever you consider a wide range of numbers from 1 to 10 to use, or in the current case 1 to 100, it does seem like it does lump a lot of them near the high end. But what does make a bad album? What makes an album that causes me to come on to the camera here and react really negatively and yell and scream and act like a ridiculous spoof move? Well, we're here to talk about a couple of those things. The first thing that we really consider, that I consider at least, is what the band has done either in the past or what the band has kind of been known for, what they've kind of done as compared to what they did on that album. Now, stylistic shifts, not to mention kind of taking a one-off experiment or trying something new, is not something that I really dissuade. It's something that I encourage, even though it seems as though a lot of the albums that I've received poorly over the past couple of years have been kind of these experiments gone bad, and I've oftentimes used that metaphor to kind of describe it. However, it's something where the experiment could very easily work well and really go over very well, but by the same token, that same experiment could become a really, really poor idea, something that doesn't go well over at all, and something that just doesn't sound like the same band, either that or doesn't sound like anything that's really all that good. Consider Lud Divinum Insanus for a minute by Morbid Angel, one of the most famous Cover Killer Nation videos of all time. This is a band that had been straight up death metal for pretty much its entire career, and then decided to do this album, which incorporated a little bit more of a dark wave sense, or a dark wave feel, to combine it with death metal and try something now that's essentially brand new. The result was something that was extremely divided. For those people who really didn't enjoy this album, it was something that was widely lamented, and lamented in a loud voice. Of course, we remember the video. At one point in time, there was a publication that said I sounded like a WWE wrestler in the way in which I was preaching negatively and preaching hate on this album. It's still something that to this day I find to be one of my highest honors. By that same token, though, the same band could definitely do something that is, somewhat better, either that or a different experiment that is a little bit more in tuned or honed toward their talents, and really pull it off. The main reason why I don't think this album really worked out very well for Morbid Angel was the fact that the dark wave influence seemed to be a little bit forced. It was something that didn't have a great sense of balance to it, and the whole entire breadth of the album just felt completely jutted off. It was something that was extremely disjointed. It didn't have a lot to really go off of. The legs that this album was standing on were very, very crippled, almost from the very get-go. In short, whenever you listen to it, it was unlike any Morbid Angel album that you ever heard, and that was a problem, principally because they had made a career of one thing, and then suddenly moving over to another was just kind of a really, really harsh slap in the face. It's almost like Saint Anger all over again. Remember, whenever Saint Anger came out, a lot of people were upset about it because it was an oversimplified style. It was something that really took a garage approach as opposed to the approach that you'd heard in the previous albums. Even Load and Reload were not taken very well because they experimented a little bit more with a blues-oriented rock sound, or a blues metal sound. Metallica really took a little bit of a risk there, but it was almost like a further progression of what you heard on the Black Album. It was just something that went even softer, if you wanted to call it that. It was something that was more resembling a rock and metal sound as opposed to the thrash metal that you had heard in the 1980s. Now, initially, these albums were not very well received by true metalheads or real die-hard Metallica fans, but there were new fans that really were ushered in by the band that were mainly brought over by television exposure or radio exposure, and the band definitely expanded their horizons a lot more. That's kind of an experiment that sort of went right for a band. Yeah, you might think that it didn't go right, but it kind of did. They expanded their horizons and their fan base, tenfold, and they were able to usher in a brand new era of Metallica fans. But what if something is just plain flat out generic? Let's define generic firstly. Let's define what generic is really all about. If you're a band that's trying something new, if you're attempting some radical experiment that is trying to kind of forwardly think. Like, for example, Periphery, for example, starting the Jet movement in a real hardcore style, then this is something that makes it very, very difficult to kind of, give up a little bit of, applause to the band for trying something that really hasn't been tried before. Either that or hasn't been done in a wide scale. A lot of people say that it was just heavily Meshuggah penned, and it was something that had a lot of their tailor-made influences on there, and they were basically just a Meshuggah copycat. But at the same time, they ushered in a whole entire new sub-genre, a whole small little subsection of metal based around that album and that album alone. And you had to give them a lot of props for doing that. And there were other bands that were a portion of that idea as well, such as Tesseract and Cloudkicker, and really the whole idea really took off, and you had to give them a little bit of praise for trying something different. However, being generic basically means latching on to something that's already pre-established and really just not doing anything to further the sound, not doing anything to actually enhance the sound, just basically going with the humdrum basic idea of what it's all about and sticking to nothing but that. This is something that happens especially whenever you see the overexposure of certain subgenres of metal or of music in general, and you see that record companies are starting to buy out and, purchase contracts for each and every single band that is of that style. That way they think that they have a competitive edge as far as the sales are concerned. They basically see something that is really being encouraged by the sales and something that the public really seems to be latching on to. They buy up every band that they hear that sounds kind of similar to that, and they throw it onto the market and essentially flood it. This happened with metalcore, and for a while there it looked like it was going to happen with deathcore, but things are starting to really slow down a little bit with that. But on the rock side, you can definitely see how that's happened with emo-core, with post-hardcore, or pop-punk. Basically all the things that you see either on the Warped Tour, either that or everything that you see on those Pop Goes Blank compilations, which is just absolutely ridiculous. This flooding of the market is not something that needs to be done because it's essentially more often than not just another rehashing of the same thing, the same tired idea that has been heard 7 to 8 times before by 7 or 8 different bands, and something that is not actually being furthered by the band that is now being heard, the 9th band that we're talking about here. If your band is doing something generic, especially if they're a band that's been around for a while, either that or you're about 2 or 3 albums in, then there's a good chance that there's no way that you're going to be received very well. You're going to be seen as just a tired member of the same scene that's doing something that 1,001 other bands are doing, and you don't stick out. You're not an individual. You're not unique. There's nothing about what you do that really holds any sort of value aside from the fact that you're able to string music together. You were able to, perform self-expression. There's no failure at self-expression. However, in a system that has to have a little bit of quantifiable purpose to it, you have to understand that if you're band number 17,000 in a certain subgenre and you're not doing anything to improve it, then you're not going to get a lot of praise. Instead, it's just going to be seen as more of the same. Now, you might think, what makes rap continue to have such great reviews and things like that? Well, you're actually able to do a lot more to rap than many people take into account. There are certain subgenres of rap, just like there are certain subgenres of metal, which means that there is a little bit of something in rap for everybody. There might be even a rapper that you enjoy. Another thing that really bogs down an album is a disjointed flow. Now, you've probably heard me say this 1,001 times and probably don't totally understand what I mean by that. The flow that I'm speaking about is the flow between songs, and the flow between the songs of the album as a complete whole. So, for example, if you have a 12-song album, and the flow between track 1 and track 12 all seems very seamless, it has a very good consistency to it. This is not something that really has to rely on peaks and valleys all that much, or jagged edges, I think is the best way that I can put it. Then you have a good chance of having a pretty decent review, either that or a pretty tight album. A tightness to an album is something that's critical, principally because you don't want your listener to feel as though they're going from left field to right field all the time. This is something where you need to have a little bit of consistency with your record. You have to have a little bit of consistency of how that record is being handled and managed. If you want to have a slower song come right after a song that has a lot of flurry to it, then that's great. You can do that. You can really throw a listener through for a curve that first time. But if you're relying on that heavily, if you're doing that all the time, then that has a disjointed flow. That's something where you are basically keeping your album from ever attaining any sort of momentum and ever getting any sort of progress toward being a really fitting, a really smooth affair, something that has a lot of value to it. If you have to really rely on those real jagged edges, those thick peaks, those very, very low valleys and things like that, then there's a good chance that your listener is going to become very disassociated with your album before it's even halfway done. They're going to be able to tell. And don't think that just because you have 4 songs that's going to make it all the easier. For one, if you have 4 super long songs and they're disjointed, the songs themselves, and there's even a disjoint between track 1 and track 2, that's going to be even harder to recover from, principally because there's only 4 tracks and you have to do something to redeem yourself almost instantaneously. If you can't do that out of the gate, then damn, you're in a lot of trouble, and that is something that is really, really hard to recover from. Now, this isn't to say that after 1 or 2 tracks you can immediately tell whether or not an album is going to be bad. That's not the truth whatsoever. However, you can definitely tell a negative flow or a flow that's going very poorly almost from the get-go. If you feel a lot of disjoint between the first couple of tracks, there's a good chance that this band's not going to learn from mistakes. They're instead trying to really make this an attractive property of their album, and it's not something that works very often. That's kind of a rare situation where bands actually actively try to do that. They actively try to make it a very disjointed experience, something that's almost very damaging to the senses. But most of the bands that have attempted to do this have not been met with favorable reviews. Either that, or if they have, it's basically been because every single track on the album is a spellbinding affair, something where you can't ignore it. And that's probably the one way that you can recover from something like that, by making each and every song so gosh darn important and so goddamn memorable that you almost forget about the fact that there was a flow in the album to begin with. Another thing that definitely goes into account is the fact that the songs that are on the album have to be, as I just mentioned, standout tracks. Standout tracks are songs that have a lot of meaning, something where you are able to very quickly recall them after they are over. These are the ones that you may be more inclined to go back to and revisit whenever the replay is over of the album. Either that, or you may replay them instantaneously. You might not be able to go through the rest of the album without listening to that track again and again and again. The number of spellbinding songs that you have on your album is absolutely critical. And also, what is also critical is the number of stinkers, the number of B-sides, the filler tracks, as most people say. Filler track is actually the best and the most accurate way to describe it, considering a B-side is an old single proclamation, where basically it was the flip side of what the main single, the main song was supposed to be. And usually B-sides were pretty cool. You got the covers there, and you got all of the neat things that you now traditionally get with deluxe editions of albums, or, bonus CDs in limited edition copies, or during re-releases. The number of filler songs that you have is definitely critical, because you can definitely think about your album almost like a test. Think about it. If you have 10 tracks on your album and you have 3 spellbinding songs and you have 4 songs that are pretty decent but not necessarily instant memory, then you have 7 out of 10 good songs on your album. Right there, if you want to consider it, that's 7 out of 10. That's a 7. That's a 7 out of 10 score for that album. You have 7 great songs backed behind 3 songs that are kind of cruddy. Now, let's take this one step further. If you have 3 songs that are instantly memorable, but 7 are clunkers, does that make it a 3 out of 10? Absolutely not. What are the quality of the 3 spellbinding songs on that album? Does that actually redeem it? Does it actually boost up its score a little bit, maybe to a 4 or a 5? There's a good potential for that. Bands are sometimes capable of writing some phenomenal music that's actually able to tip the balance of the score of the album in their favor or against their favor. And you have to remember that filler songs don't necessarily just mean, boring songs that don't have any sort of life to them. They mean just bad songs that really just have no quality to them whatsoever, that almost sound like the band was just in there spack-macking around and expect everybody to just eat it up because they are who they are. This is something that pop music and rap music is more so guilty of, considering you hear a lot of customers talk about how there's only 1 or 2 good songs on the album, and the rest of them they could care less about. Well, a lot of these people are also just casual music fans and very boring music fans. They only like singles for the most part, but at the same time, some of the more dedicated music fans that are able to agree with this assessment are primarily saying this because the singles are the songs that seem to have the most punch behind them, the ones that have the most time really dedicated to them, whereas the rest of them were kind of just written haphazardly or just thrown on there at the last second. That way they would have enough to release an album. This is something that's not the case in heavy metal, though at the same time, the songs that are written sometimes can feel very, very lackluster. They can feel very much like clunkers, and whenever that happens, it definitely does help create a bad album. A bad album can be created whenever there are more clunkers than there are memorable moments on an album, and it also can be made whenever those memorable moments are so sparse in between the clunkers that it's almost impossible to make it to the memorable moments without wanting to shut the album off. Finally, and probably one of the ideas that really you can't necessarily be guilty of unless you are making yourself very aware of, and that's timing. Timing is exceptionally important whenever it comes to an album. You have to make sure, to go along with the last statement, that your spellbinding tracks are ever present if you want to have a very lengthy affair. This is especially true with progressive music. Progressive music is able to offer a lot of different things to a listener because it's able to take the music in so many different directions. It's almost like whenever you listen to a progressive album, you are not sure what you're going to get yourself into, but you know that you're going to be taken in multiple directions, and the musicianship is definitely going to be the real glue that's able to keep you on board. That's the reason why, even though these albums are reaching the 65, 70, 75, close to 80-minute mark, and some of them even go as deep as the double albums, such as an Arion album, you're still able to stay very focused on them. You still really want to continue forward with the album because you're still latched very much in by the songwriting, by the lyricisms, and by everything that you're able to hear from this album that just really is able to offer a big-time difference. That quality is definitely more important than quantity. There are a lot of bands out there that don't understand that. They have a quantity of tracks that easily wrap into 55 to 60 minutes, and maybe they have 13 or 14 songs, and they're 3 or 4 songs too large. There are many, many, many poor albums that easily could have become average albums at least if they would have eliminated 3 or 4 tracks of clutter. Dedicated to Chaos by Queensrÿche is especially guilty of this. They could have easily taken off 5 or 6 tracks off of that album, and it actually would have been an average album. It probably wouldn't have been quite as bad as it was, really remembered as being the 2011 worst album of the year, which is actually worse than Morbid Angels of Ludovidium Insanus, which was released the same damn year. 2011 was really just a bad year. Overindulgence is definitely a problem that a lot of bands tend to have, either that or underindulgence. Yeah, underindulgence is actually possible. However, this is something that doesn't tend to actually affect a score all that much. It's just something that leaves you with a little bit of a longing for more. This isn't going to have that much of an effect on the value or the score. However, some people may actually be upset by this, but this is something that you're just going to have to deal with. Finally, the one thing that has to be really cited about all of this is that even though I just gave you a bunch of reasons and a bunch of things that I look for in order to really see if an album is good or bad, one of the biggest aspects that goes into it is definitely opinion. It's an objective opinion, don't get me wrong. It's not something where I'm going to kiss somebody's ass just because I want to or just because someone tells me to. This is instead just an opinion based around how you yourself feel about the album. Now, whether or not something is your cup of tea, you have to be objective about that, which is kind of one of the things that I'm looking to rectify whenever it comes to deathcore, metalcore, and a couple of other things here in 2014. But at the same time, you also have to make sure that you're being fair to yourself. You can't necessarily claim that something is awesome whenever you found absolutely nothing of value on the album. If you think that something is generic, then hey, that's what you feel. If you think that something has more clunkers, more stinkers than great songs, then hey, that's what you feel as well. But you have to look at overall quality, and that's one of the most important ways to determine whether or not an album is bad or good. Your overall opinion of the overall quality of the album. Was it good? Was it bad? Was it worth listening to? Is it one that you're going to listen to again? Or is this one that after you finish this playback and perhaps type or record your review, you're never going to listen to again? Is this one that's just going to accompany a space on your shelf and never move? Or is this going to be one that is going to be moving so often that you hope to hell that you never accidentally lose it? There you are, ladies and gentlemen. If you're wondering what I look for in a good album, maybe we'll do a video on that, but that's only if you guys want it. Let me know in the comments whether or not you want to see me tell you what I've determined to be a good album. Although, I'm pretty sure that you can assess some of those things from the comments that I've made on this video. But if you'd like something a little bit more expansive, then let me know. Talk to you guys later. I hope that you enjoyed this window into the soul, window into the Cover Killer Nation studios, into the Cover Killer Nation style of thinking. Of course, thumbs this up, like it, subscribe it, and tell all of your friends. Share this one around because this is one that everyone needs to see. I'll see you guys next time.